The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Queen Consort Catherine walked through the grand hallway, her heels clicking against the polished stone. She had always found comfort in the early hours when the palace was quiet, before the staff arrived, and the day's obligations began. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. Catherine had been Queen Consort for 3 years now, ever since King George had passed away and her husband Edward had ascended to the throne. The transition had been difficult for everyone, but perhaps most challenging for Prince William, Edward's eldest son from his first marriage. The relationship between Catherine and William had always been complicated, marked by politeness but lacking genuine warmth. As she entered the breakfast room, Catherine found Edward already seated at the mahogany table, his morning newspapers spread before him. His face was pale, more so than usual, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. The sight immediately alarmed her. "Darling, what's wrong?" Catherine asked, settling into the chair beside him. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Edward looked up at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear that she had never seen before. In all their years together, through the scandals and the public criticism, through the death of his first wife Princess Diana, and the difficult early years of their relationship being scrutinized by the media, she had never seen him look so shaken. "Catherine," he began, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk. Something has happened, something that could destroy everything we've worked for." Before Catherine could respond, the breakfast room door opened and Thomas, Catherine's son from her first marriage, entered with a confidence that seemed forced. At 35, Thomas had always been charming and ambitious, working as a successful journalist and food critic. But today his usual easy smile was replaced by a look of grim determination. "Mother, father," Thomas said, using the formal address he had adopted when Edward became king. "I assume you've heard about the recording?" Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. "What recording, Thomas? What are you talking about?" Thomas pulled out his phone and placed it on the table between them. The device seemed to glow ominously in the morning light streaming through the tall windows. 3 days ago, I was at a private dinner party. The wine was flowing, the conversation was casual, and I thought I was among friends. I spoke freely about family matters, about the challenges of being part of the royal family, about the pressure and the expectations. Edward leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "What exactly did you say, Thomas?" "I talked about the struggles of our family dynamics," Thomas continued, his voice growing quieter. "I mentioned how difficult it's been for Mother to find her place in the royal hierarchy. I spoke about the financial pressures, about how the public doesn't understand the real costs of maintaining our lifestyle. I talked about William's resentment toward Mother, about how he still blames her for his parents' divorce." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. These were private family matters, the kind of intimate details that the royal family had spent decades keeping away from public scrutiny. The very foundation of their public image rested on maintaining an appearance of unity and dignity. "But, most damaging," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I spoke about the arrangement regarding the Duchy of Cornwall income, about how funds have been redirected to support Mother's charitable foundations. I mentioned specific amounts, specific agreements that were never meant to be public knowledge." The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, Catherine could hear the distant sounds of London awakening, traffic beginning to build, the early morning joggers in Hyde Park, the city coming to life. But inside this room, it felt as though time had stopped. Edward was the first to speak. "Who else was at this dinner, Thomas? Who heard these conversations?" "That's the problem," Thomas replied, running his hands through his dark hair. "I thought it was just close friends, people I trusted. But it turns out that Marcus Wellington, the newspaper publisher, was there. He recorded everything on his phone. At first, I thought it was just casual conversation, but now I realize he was deliberately drawing me out, asking leading questions to get me to reveal more." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. Marcus Wellington was known for his ruthless pursuit of royal scandals. His newspapers had been responsible for some of the most damaging stories about the royal family over the past decade. If he had a recording of Thomas discussing private family finances and personal conflicts, it would be front-page news within days. "How do you know he recorded it?" Edward asked, though his tone suggested he already dreaded the answer. Thomas's shoulders sagged. "Because he called me yesterday. He played back portions of the recording over the phone. He has everything, my comments about the financial arrangements, about William's feelings toward Mother, about the private agreements that were made when you became king." He's threatening to publish it all unless... Unless what? Catherine asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Unless Mother agrees to step back from her royal duties and reduce her public profile significantly. He wants her to announce that she's withdrawing from most of her patronages and charitable work. He's essentially asking her to disappear from public life. The breakfast room, which had always been Catherine's favorite space in the palace, suddenly felt suffocating. The painted walls, depicting scenes of British countryside, seemed to close in around her. This room had witnessed countless family conversations over the years, but none as potentially devastating as this one. Edward stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Catherine recognized as his way of controlling his anger. "The timing couldn't be worse," Edward said, his voice tight with frustration. "We're in the middle of the Commonwealth tour planning. The government is already questioning the cost of the monarchy. There are rumors that several Commonwealth nations are considering becoming republics. If this story breaks now, it could tip the balance against us." Catherine felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. When she had married Edward, she had known that becoming part of the royal family would mean sacrificing her privacy and accepting intense scrutiny. But she had never imagined that her own son would be the source of such a potentially catastrophic leak. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "I need you to tell me exactly what you said. Word for word. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Thomas pulled out a notebook from his jacket pocket. His hand shook slightly as he opened it. "I wrote down everything I could remember as soon as I realized what had happened. I started by talking about how difficult the transition had been after King George's death. I mentioned that you felt like an outsider sometimes, that the palace staff still treated you differently than they had treated Diana." Each word felt like a dagger to Catherine's heart. These were feelings she had shared with Thomas during private moments, when the pressure of royal life had become overwhelming. She had never imagined that he would repeat them in public, even among people he considered friends. "I talked about the financial restructuring that happened when Father became king," Thomas continued. "I mentioned that some of the Duchy of Cornwall income was redirected to support your charitable work, and that William had objected to this arrangement. I said that William felt that money should have gone directly to him as the heir apparent." Edward turned from the window, his face flushed with anger. "Those financial arrangements were confidential agreements made in consultation with the government and the Privy Council. If the public learns about the specific details of how royal finances are managed, it will raise questions about transparency and accountability that we're not prepared to answer." "There's more," Thomas said reluctantly. "I talked about the personal dynamics between you and William. I mentioned that he still blames Mother for the breakdown of his parents' marriage, even though that happened years before you became seriously involved with Father. I said that William has never fully accepted Mother as his stepmother, and that this creates tension at family gatherings." Catherine closed her eyes, trying to process the full extent of the damage. The relationship between her and William had indeed been strained for years. William had been only 15 when his parents divorced, and despite Edward's attempts to rebuild their relationship before marrying Catherine, there had always been an underlying tension. The irony was that Catherine had genuinely tried to build a relationship with William. She had been careful never to try to replace his mother's memory, had always encouraged Edward to prioritize his relationship with his children, and had worked hard to support William's charitable endeavors. But William had remained distant, polite, but never warm. "What else?" Edward asked, though his tone suggested he was dreading more revelations. "I mentioned the arguments about the living arrangements," Thomas continued. "When you became king, there were discussions about who would live where. I said that William wanted Mother to move to a smaller residence, that he felt Kensington Palace should be reserved for direct heirs to the throne. I talked about how this had created friction within the family. This was perhaps the most painful revelation for Catherine. The discussions about living arrangements had been particularly difficult because they had touched on fundamental questions about her place in the royal hierarchy. As queen consort, she had certain traditional rights and privileges, but William had argued that as a divorced woman who had married into the family, she should accept a more modest role. The breakfast room door opened again, and Private Secretary James Morrison entered with his usual impeccable timing. James had served the royal family for over 20 years and had an uncanny ability to sense when important conversations were taking place. "Your Majesties," James said with a slight bow, "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to brief you on the media situation. There are rumors circulating in Fleet Street about a potential royal scandal." Several newspapers have been making inquiries about financial arrangements and family dynamics. Edward exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. What kind of inquiries, James? Questions about the Duchy of Cornwall income distribution, about the Queen Consort's charitable foundations, and about living arrangements within the royal residences. The questions are very specific, which suggests that someone has provided detailed information. Catherine felt sick to her stomach. The rumors were already starting to spread, which meant they had very little time before the story broke completely. There's something else, James continued. Prince William has requested an urgent meeting with you, Your Majesty. His office said it was regarding sensitive family matters and that it couldn't wait for the regular weekly briefing. Thomas paled visibly. He knows. Somehow, William has found out about the recording. Edward's jaw tightened. How could he know already? Marcus Wellington said he hadn't published anything yet. Wellington might have reached out to the palace for comment, James suggested. Or there might be other sources. In my experience, when stories like this begin to circulate, information spreads quickly through unofficial channels. Catherine stood up from the table, her legs feeling unsteady. She had always known that being part of the royal family meant living under constant scrutiny, but she had never imagined that the greatest threat would come from within her own family. The thought that her son's careless words could destroy everything she had worked to build over the past decade was almost unbearable. When does William want to meet? Edward asked. This afternoon, Your Majesty. 2 o'clock in the blue drawing room. Catherine felt a chill at the mention of the blue drawing room. It was the most formal reception room in the palace, used for official meetings and state business. The choice of location suggested that William was approaching this as an official matter rather than a family discussion. James, Edward said, I need you to contact our legal team immediately. We need to know what our options are regarding this recording. Can we prevent publication? Are there privacy laws that might apply? And I want to know everything about Marcus Wellington's financial situation. If he's vulnerable to pressure, we need to know about it. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll have a full briefing prepared within the hour. After James left, the 3 family members sat in silence for several minutes. The morning sun had risen higher, and the breakfast room was now filled with bright light, but the atmosphere remained heavy with dread. Mother, Thomas finally said, I know how badly I've messed up. I was drunk, I was showing off, and I said things that should never have been said in public. I take full responsibility for this situation. Catherine looked at her son, seeing not the confident journalist and food critic that the public knew, but the young boy who had struggled to adapt when she married Edward. Thomas had been 12 when she became part of the royal family, and the adjustment had been difficult for him. He had gone from being the son of a relatively private woman to being a member of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. The question now isn't about blame, Catherine said quietly. The question is what we do next. We have a few hours before William arrives, and we need to decide how to handle this situation. Edward returned to his seat at the table. Our options are limited. We can try to negotiate with Wellington, but he clearly has the upper hand. We can prepare a public statement that tries to minimize the damage, but that might just draw more attention to the story. Or we can try to discredit the recording somehow. What about legal action? Catherine asked. Possible, but risky, Edward replied. If we go to court to try to prevent publication, it will only generate more media attention. And there's no guarantee we would win. The courts have generally sided with press freedom in cases involving public figures. Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest. What if I took full responsibility? I could give a public interview explaining that I was drunk, that I exaggerated things, that my comments don't represent the real situation within the family. That might help, Edward said, but it won't eliminate the damage. Even if people accept that you were exaggerating, the basic facts would still be out there. The financial arrangements, the family tensions. Once that information is public, we can't take it back. Catherine felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had always known that marrying Edward would mean accepting a life of public scrutiny, but she had never imagined that her own son would be the source of such potential damage. The irony was particularly painful because Thomas had always been her closest confidant, the person she turned to when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming. There's something else we need to consider, Catherine said slowly. Even if we manage to contain this immediate crisis, the damage to family relationships might be irreparable. William already resents me, and this will only make things worse. If he believes that Thomas deliberately leaked damaging information, it could create a permanent rift within the family. Edward nodded grimly. The family unity has always been fragile since my first marriage ended. We've managed to maintain a public appearance of harmony, but, privately, there have always been tensions. This could be the event that brings everything out into the open. The breakfast room, which had been their sanctuary for so many mornings over the years, now felt like a prison. Catherine looked around at the familiar furnishings, the antique sideboard where their morning coffee was served, the portraits of previous monarchs looking down from the walls, the fresh flowers that were replaced every day by the palace staff. All of these symbols of royal tradition and continuity now seemed threatened by a few careless words spoken at a dinner party. "Whatever we decide to do," Catherine said finally, "we need to present a united front. If the family appears divided, it will only make the situation worse. We need to make sure that when William arrives this afternoon, we're prepared with a clear plan and a consistent message." Edward reached across the table and took her hand. Despite all the years they had been together, through all the public criticism and private challenges, his touch still provided comfort. "We'll get through this, Catherine. We've survived worse crises before." But, as Catherine looked out at the palace gardens, where tourists were already beginning to gather hoping for a glimpse of royal life, she couldn't shake the feeling that this crisis was different. This time, the threat came from within their own family, and the damage might be impossible to repair. The morning light that had seemed so promising when she first entered the breakfast room now felt harsh and unforgiving. In just a few hours, they would face William's fury, and Catherine had no idea how they would explain that the person who had potentially destroyed the family's reputation was her own son. As they sat in the growing silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges ahead, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end of everything they had worked so hard to build together. The blue drawing room had always been Catherine's least favorite space in Kensington Palace. With its formal blue silk wallpaper, gilt-framed mirrors, and imposing crystal chandeliers, it represented everything that still felt foreign to her about royal life. Today, as she waited for Prince William to arrive, the room felt more intimidating than ever. Catherine sat in one of the high-backed chairs near the marble fireplace, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She had changed from her casual morning attire into a navy blue dress suit, armor for the battle she knew was coming. Beside her, Edward paced back and forth across the Persian carpet, his footsteps muffled but his agitation evident in every movement. The past 4 hours had been a whirlwind of meetings with legal advisors, communication specialists, and senior palace staff. The consensus had been grim. If Marcus Wellington published the recording, it would create a scandal that could seriously damage the monarchy's reputation at a time when public support was already fragile. Private Secretary James Morrison had delivered increasingly worrying updates throughout the morning. More newspapers were asking questions about royal finances. Social media was buzzing with vague rumors about a royal crisis. Most troubling of all, sources within William's household had indicated that the prince was furious beyond measure about something involving the queen consort and her family. "He's late," Edward muttered, glancing at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. It was already 10 minutes past 2 o'clock, and William's punctuality was legendary within the royal family. "Perhaps he's having second thoughts about this meeting," Catherine suggested, though she knew this was unlikely. In the 15 years she had known William, he had never been one to avoid confrontation when he felt wronged. The door opened, and James Morrison entered with his characteristic discretion. "Your Majesties, Prince William has arrived. Shall I show him in?" Edward nodded curtly. "Yes, and, James, please ensure we're not disturbed for the next hour." "Of course, Your Majesty." As James retreated, Catherine felt her heart rate increase. She had always found William intimidating, even when he was being polite. There was something in his pale blue eyes, so much like his father's, that seemed to see right through her pretenses to the middle-class woman from Wiltshire who had somehow found herself queen consort of the United Kingdom. The door opened again, and William entered the blue drawing room with the confident stride that had been drilled into him since childhood. At 41, he was tall and lean like his father, but there was a hardness to his features that spoke of years of public scrutiny and private disappointment. Today, that hardness seemed particularly pronounced. "Father." "Catherine." William's greeting was icily formal. He didn't offer to shake hands or give the customary kiss on the cheek that had become routine at family gatherings. "William," Edward replied, gesturing toward the seating area. "Please sit down. We need to talk about this situation." William remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that Catherine recognized as barely controlled anger. "Oh, I think we're well beyond talking, Father. What I want to know is how long you've known about this recording and why nobody thought to inform me that my stepmother's son was planning to sell out the royal family. The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. William, that's not what happened. Thomas didn't deliberately, didn't he? William interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Because from what I've heard, your precious son spent an entire evening entertaining dinner guests with intimate details about our family's private affairs. Details that he could only have learned from you. Edward stepped forward, his own anger beginning to surface. That's enough, William. I know you're upset, but you will not speak to Catherine that way. William's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. Oh, now you're defending her? That's rich, father. You've spent 15 years prioritizing her feelings over the interests of this family, and now we're all going to pay the price. Catherine stood up, her composure finally cracking. How dare you suggest that I've been prioritized? I've spent every day of the last 15 years trying to support this family, to honor the traditions of the monarchy, and to find my place without overstepping boundaries. And all of it while knowing that you've resented my very existence. Because you don't belong here. William shot back, his careful public composure completely abandoned. You were a divorced commoner with a teenage son who somehow convinced my father to marry you 6 months after my mother's death. And now your family's carelessness is going to destroy everything my mother and grandmother worked to build. The reference to Diana hit Catherine like a physical blow. It was the accusation that had haunted their relationship from the beginning, the suggestion that she had somehow stolen Edward from his first wife. The truth was far more complicated. Diana and Edward had been separated for 2 years before Catherine ever met him, and their divorce had been finalized months before Catherine and Edward's relationship became romantic. But William had never accepted this version of events. Your mother and I were already divorced when I met Catherine, Edward said, his voice dangerously quiet. You know that. You've always known that. The divorce was a technicality, William replied. You and mother were trying to work things out. Everyone knew that. But then Catherine came along with her charming son and her middle-class ambitions, and suddenly, reconciliation was impossible. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This had always been the unspoken accusation between them, the belief that she had somehow destroyed William's family. The reality was that Diana and Edward's marriage had been troubled for years before Catherine ever appeared, but William had chosen to blame her for the final breakdown. That's not true, William, Catherine said, her voice trembling with emotion. Your parents' marriage had problems that had nothing to do with me. I never tried to come between them. I never even knew about their reconciliation attempts until years later. But you knew about the financial arrangements, didn't you? William continued, his tone becoming more accusatory. You knew that when father became king, part of the Duchy of Cornwall income would be redirected to fund your charitable work. Money that traditionally would have gone to support the heir apparent's household. This was the heart of William's resentment, Catherine realized. It wasn't just about his mother or about Catherine's place in the family hierarchy. It was about money, about the practical realities of royal finance that were usually hidden behind layers of tradition and protocol. Those arrangements were made in consultation with the government, Edward said firmly. The Privy Council approved every decision. Catherine's charitable work generates significant positive publicity for the crown. The return on investment. William interrupted incredulously. We're talking about the crown, father, not a business venture. These traditions exist for a reason. The Duchy of Cornwall income is meant to support the heir apparent so that when they become monarch, they have the resources necessary to fulfill their duties. Catherine finally understood the depth of William's anger. This wasn't just about family dynamics or personal resentment. William genuinely believed that the financial arrangements made when Edward became king had weakened the monarchy's long-term stability. The amounts involved are relatively modest, Catherine said, trying to keep her voice calm. My charitable foundations receive less than 10% of the total duchy income, and that money is used for causes that reflect well on the royal family. Literacy programs, support for military families, environmental conservation. That's not the point, William replied. The point is that these decisions were made without proper consultation. I should have been involved in discussions about how royal resources are allocated. Instead, I learned about the arrangements after they were already implemented. Edward's face flushed with anger. You were consulted. We had 3 separate meetings about the financial restructuring. You were present for all of them. I was informed about decisions that had already been made, William corrected. There's a difference between consultation and notification. Catherine could see that this argument had been building for years. The surface politeness that had characterized family gatherings had been masking deep resentment about decision-making processes and financial priorities. But even if you disagreed with those arrangements, Catherine said, how does that justify your reaction to Thomas's mistake? He made an error in judgment, but it wasn't malicious. William turned to face her directly, his expression cold. Wasn't it? Because from where I stand, it looks like your son has been planning this for months. The questions he was asked at that dinner party weren't random. Someone knew exactly what to ask to get him to reveal the most damaging information. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Marcus Wellington didn't just happen to be at that dinner party with a recording device. I think your son was approached weeks or months ago. I think he was cultivated, possibly paid, to gather information about our family's private affairs. The accusation was so shocking that Catherine couldn't immediately respond. The idea that Thomas might have deliberately betrayed the family was almost unthinkable, but as she considered William's words, she remembered small details that now seemed suspicious. Thomas had been asking more questions than usual about family finances in recent months. He had seemed unusually interested in the details of royal protocol and decision-making processes. That's a very serious accusation, Edward said quietly. Do you have any evidence to support it? William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder. My security team has been investigating since we first learned about the recording. They've discovered that Thomas has been in financial difficulty for the past 6 months. His restaurant investments have been failing, and he's accumulated significant debts. Catherine felt sick to her stomach as William opened the folder and began reading from documents. Thomas owes approximately £400,000 to various creditors. His main restaurant lost money for 18 consecutive months before closing last year. His food criticism work provides income, but not nearly enough to cover his lifestyle expenses. Each revelation felt like a dagger to Catherine's heart. Thomas had never mentioned financial problems to her. If anything, he had seemed more prosperous than ever in recent months, taking expensive vacations and making lavish purchases. 3 months ago, William continued, Thomas was approached by a representative of Wellington Media Group. They offered him a consultant position that would pay £50,000 for insights into contemporary British society and culture. The job required no specific deliverables beyond attending social events and filing occasional reports. Catherine's hands were shaking as she began to understand the implications. You're saying that Marcus Wellington paid Thomas to gather information about our family? That's exactly what I'm saying, William replied. And the evidence suggests that Thomas was specifically instructed to learn about our financial arrangements and internal family dynamics. The dinner party where the recording was made was the culmination of months of careful planning. Edward sank into one of the chairs, looking suddenly older than his 63 years. How long have you known about this, William? I received the initial report yesterday afternoon. That's why I requested this urgent meeting. I wanted to give you the opportunity to explain before I take this information to the Privy Council. The threat was clear. William wasn't just angry about the recording or the potential scandal. He was prepared to use this crisis to force broader changes within the royal family structure. Catherine felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal. If William's allegations were true, then Thomas hadn't just made a careless mistake at a dinner party. He had deliberately gathered information about the royal family's private affairs and sold that information to their enemies in the press. I need to speak with Thomas immediately, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid that's not possible, William replied. Thomas left the country this morning. According to immigration records, he flew to Switzerland on a private jet. My sources suggest he has no immediate plans to return. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. Thomas had fled the country without telling her, without even saying goodbye. After everything they had been through together, after all the years she had protected and supported him, he had abandoned her to face this crisis alone. Switzerland, Edward repeated grimly. A country with very strict privacy laws and no extradition treaty for non-criminal matters. Quite convenient, William observed. Almost as if the whole thing was planned in advance. Catherine could no longer hold back her tears. The son she had raised and protected, the person she had trusted more than anyone else in the world, had betrayed not just her but the entire royal family. The financial information he had revealed, the personal details about family relationships, the private arrangements that had taken years to negotiate, all of it was now in the hands of hostile media organizations. What happens now? Catherine asked, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. William's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. That depends on what you're prepared to do to contain the damage. What do you mean? Wellington's demands were quite specific. He wants you to step back from public life, to reduce your royal duties significantly, and to distance yourself from any involvement in financial or administrative matters. If you agree to these terms, he's prepared to limit the publication to a relatively minor story about family disagreements. Catherine felt a surge of anger. You want me to destroy everything I've built over the past 15 years because of your son's betrayal? I want you to put the interests of the monarchy ahead of your personal pride, William replied. Your presence in this family has always been controversial. Now that controversy threatens to bring down the entire institution. Edward stood up abruptly. That's enough, William. Catherine is queen consort, and she has every right to fulfill the duties that come with that position. Does she? William asked. Because the last time I checked, the British people didn't elect her to that position. She holds it by marriage, and that marriage has always been a source of division within this family. The argument that followed was unlike anything Catherine had ever witnessed within the royal family. Years of suppressed resentment, careful politeness, and unspoken grievances erupted into open conflict. William accused Edward of prioritizing his personal happiness over the monarchy's stability. Edward accused William of undermining the crown with his constant criticism and resistance to change. Catherine found herself caught in the middle, blamed for problems that had existed long before she joined the family. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this crisis was about much more than Thomas's recording or Wellington's blackmail. It was about fundamental questions of succession, modernization, and the future direction of the British monarchy. William represented the traditionalist view that the royal family should minimize change and maintain historical precedents. Edward and Catherine represented a more progressive approach that sought to adapt royal traditions to contemporary realities. The Blue Drawing Room, with its symbols of royal grandeur and historical continuity, became the battleground for these competing visions. As the three family members argued about immediate tactics and long-term strategy, Catherine couldn't help but wonder if the monarchy they were fighting to preserve was worth saving at all. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been resolved. William had made his ultimatum clear. Either Catherine would voluntarily reduce her public role, or he would take the matter to the Privy Council and potentially to Parliament itself. Edward had refused to consider any reduction in Catherine's duties. Catherine herself felt torn between her loyalty to her husband and her desire to protect the institution that had become her life's work. As William left the Blue Drawing Room, his final words echoed in Catherine's mind. You have 24 hours to decide. After that, I'll assume you've chosen to let the monarchy burn rather than accept responsibility for the damage your family has caused. The confrontation was over, but Catherine knew the real battle was just beginning. The secure communications room in the basement of Kensington Palace was a place few members of the royal family ever visited. Located 3 floors below ground level, behind reinforced steel doors and sophisticated security systems, it was where the monarchy's most sensitive intelligence operations were coordinated. Catherine had never been in this room before, but desperate circumstances called for desperate measures. Sir Michael Hartwell, the director of royal security, sat across from her at a metal table that looked distinctly out of place, surrounded by banks of computer monitors and communication equipment. In his late 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military intelligence, Sir Michael was not the sort of man who usually dealt directly with family crises. But when those crises threatened national security, his involvement became necessary. Your Majesty, Sir Michael began, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. I've completed a preliminary investigation into your son's financial situation and his connections to Wellington Media Group. I'm afraid the picture is more complex than Prince William initially suggested. Catherine had barely slept the night before, her mind racing through the implications of William's accusations about Thomas. The idea that her son might have deliberately betrayed the family was almost too painful to contemplate. But she needed to know the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. Tell me everything, Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. Sir Michael opened a thick file folder and began laying out photographs, bank statements, and surveillance reports. The sight of such detailed information about her son's private life was deeply unsettling, but Catherine forced herself to focus on the facts. Thomas's financial difficulties began approximately 18 months ago, Sir Michael explained. His main restaurant, Bowls and Crown, was hemorrhaging money due to poor management and an economic downturn that hit the hospitality sector particularly hard. Rather than closing the restaurant immediately, Thomas continued to invest his personal funds, apparently hoping that business would improve. Catherine studied the bank statements spread across the table. The numbers told a story of mounting desperation. Loans taken against his London flat, credit cards maxed out, desperate attempts to keep a failing business afloat. Why didn't he come to me? Catherine asked. I could have helped him. The family has resources. With respect, Your Majesty, I believe that was precisely the problem. Thomas was aware that accepting financial help from the royal family would require formal documentation and oversight. Given his lifestyle and spending habits, he may have preferred to avoid that level of scrutiny. Sir Michael pulled out a series of photographs showing Thomas at expensive restaurants, luxury vacation resorts, and high-end shopping establishments. The images painted a picture of someone living well beyond his means, maintaining an appearance of prosperity even as his financial situation deteriorated. The timeline becomes particularly interesting when we examine his contact with Wellington Media Group, Sir Michael continued. The first approach was made not 3 months ago, as Prince William suggested, but rather 8 months ago. Catherine felt her heart sink. 8 months ago would place the initial contact well before the most recent family financial discussions, suggesting that Thomas had been cultivating this relationship for far longer than anyone had realized. The approach was subtle, Sir Michael explained. Marcus Wellington didn't contact Thomas directly. Instead, one of his senior editors, Sarah Pemberton, attended a food and wine festival where Thomas was a featured speaker. She struck up a conversation about a potential collaboration between Thomas and their lifestyle publications. Catherine examined the surveillance photos of Thomas meeting with various Wellington Media Group employees. The meetings had taken place in expensive restaurants and private clubs, locations where recording devices would be unlikely and where the conversations would appear to be social rather than professional. What exactly was Thomas providing them? Catherine asked. Initially, it appears to have been relatively innocent information, details about royal dining preferences, behind-the-scenes glimpses of palace life, stories about the challenges of being connected to the royal family. The sort of content that would be valuable for lifestyle features, but not particularly damaging. Sir Michael pulled out transcripts of recorded phone conversations between Thomas and his Wellington Media Group contacts. Reading her son's words, Catherine could see how he had been gradually drawn deeper into the relationship. The requests became more specific over time, Sir Michael continued. They wanted information about family dynamics, about financial arrangements, about private conversations between senior royals. And Thomas, perhaps without fully understanding the implications, began providing increasingly sensitive details. Catherine felt sick as she read through the transcripts. Thomas had discussed her private conversations with Edward, had revealed details about William's resentment toward her, had even described confidential meetings with government ministers about constitutional reform. The dinner party where the recording was made was not a coincidence, Sir Michael said. Wellington Media Group arranged for Thomas to be invited, ensured that their people would be present, and created an environment where Thomas would feel comfortable speaking freely. They provided him with expensive wine, surrounded him with people who seemed sympathetic to his situation, and then systematically drew him out. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. Wellington hadn't just stumbled upon a disgruntled royal family member. He had carefully cultivated and manipulated Thomas over many months, gradually building trust and extracting increasingly valuable information. How much did they pay him? Catherine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The payments were structured to avoid suspicion. Rather than a single large sum, Thomas received a series of smaller payments disguised as consulting fees, speaking honoraria, and writing commissions. In total, he received approximately £150,000 over the 8-month period. Catherine closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of her son's betrayal. He had sold out his family, his stepfather, and the entire royal institution for what amounted to pocket change in royal terms. There's more, Sir Michael said gently. Our investigation suggests that Thomas may not have fully understood the implications of what he was doing. The Wellington Media Group representatives were skilled at making their requests seem routine, even patriotic. They convinced Thomas that he was helping to modernize the monarchy by providing insights that would help the press cover royal affairs more accurately. Catherine looked up sharply. Are you saying Thomas was manipulated? I'm saying that Thomas was carefully recruited and handled using sophisticated intelligence techniques. Wellington Media Group employed people with backgrounds in journalism, psychology, and even espionage. They knew exactly how to exploit Thomas's financial desperation and his complicated feelings about royal life. Sir Michael produced another set of documents, psychological profiles that Wellington's people had apparently developed about Thomas. The profiles were disturbingly accurate, identifying his insecurities about his place in the royal family, his financial anxieties, and his desire for recognition outside of his mother's shadow. They played on his resentment, Catherine realized. Thomas has always felt like an outsider in the royal family, tolerated but never truly accepted. Wellington's people made him feel important, valued, like his perspective mattered. Exactly. And they gradually convinced him that the information he was providing would ultimately benefit the royal family by helping them understand public perceptions and media strategies. Catherine felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at Thomas's betrayal, sympathy for his manipulation, and fury at the people who had exploited her son's vulnerabilities. The Wellington Media Group operation had been sophisticated and ruthless, targeting not just Thomas's financial needs, but his deepest psychological insecurities. What about his flight to Switzerland? Catherine asked. Was that part of the plan? Sir Michael's expression grew even more serious. That's where the situation becomes more complicated. Our intelligence suggests that Thomas's departure from the country was not voluntary. Catherine felt a chill of fear. What do you mean? 24 hours before the dinner party recording became known to the palace, Thomas received a phone call warning him that his arrangement with Wellington Media Group had been discovered. He was told that he needed to leave the country immediately or face potential criminal charges for violating the Official Secrets Act. The room suddenly felt very cold. Catherine realized that Thomas hadn't fled the country to avoid facing his family's anger. He had been scared into leaving by people who wanted him out of the way. Who made that call? Catherine asked. We don't know yet. The call came from an untraceable number. But the timing suggests that someone wanted Thomas out of the country before he could explain his side of the story or potentially expose the full extent of the Wellington Media Group operation. Catherine began to understand that the crisis facing her family was even more complex than she had initially realized. Thomas wasn't just a son who had made a terrible mistake. He was a victim of a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to destabilize the royal family. How much does Prince William know about this? Catherine asked. Sir Michael hesitated before answering. Prince William's security team provided some of the initial intelligence about Thomas's financial situation. However, I believe their investigation may have been incomplete. The psychological manipulation aspects, the sophisticated recruitment techniques, the possibility that Thomas was coerced into leaving the country, these elements weren't included in their briefing. Catherine realized that William's fury, while understandable, had been based on incomplete information. He had seen evidence of financial payments and concluded that Thomas was a willing collaborator, but he hadn't understood the full extent of the manipulation that had been employed. We need to tell Edward and William everything, Catherine said. They need to understand that this isn't just about Thomas making poor choices. This is about an organized attack on the monarchy using sophisticated intelligence techniques. I agree, Sir Michael said. But there's another complication. If we reveal the full extent of what we've discovered, it may become necessary to involve MI5 and potentially the police. This could become a very public investigation with implications that go far beyond family dynamics. Catherine understood the dilemma. Exposing the Wellington Media Group operation might clear Thomas of deliberate betrayal, but it could also create an even larger scandal about press manipulation and intelligence operations targeting the royal family. There's something else you need to know, Sir Michael continued. Thomas's handler at Wellington Media Group, Sarah Pemberton, has connections to foreign intelligence services. She previously worked as a journalist in Russia and China, and our counterintelligence colleagues have flagged her as a person of interest. The implications hit Catherine like a physical blow. This wasn't just about domestic press manipulation. It was potentially about foreign interference in British constitutional affairs. You're saying that foreign intelligence services might be involved in this operation? I'm saying it's a possibility we need to investigate. The techniques used to recruit and handle Thomas are consistent with foreign intelligence operations. The timing of the operation, coming during a period when several Commonwealth nations are reconsidering their relationship with the British Crown, is also suspicious. Catherine felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. What had started as a family crisis about a son's poor judgment had evolved into a potential national security issue involving press manipulation, foreign intelligence, and threats to constitutional stability. What do we do now? Catherine asked. Sir Michael began gathering the documents spread across the table. We need to brief the King and Prince William on everything we've discovered. Then, we need to decide whether to involve the security services in a formal investigation, knowing that doing so will likely make this a public matter. And Thomas? We need to establish contact with him and bring him back to the UK safely. If he's truly a victim of manipulation rather than a willing collaborator, then he may have additional information that could help us understand the full scope of this operation. Catherine stood up from the table, her mind racing through the implications of everything she had learned. The basement communications room, with its banks of monitors and sophisticated equipment, suddenly felt like a war room, which, she realized, might be exactly what it was. As Sir Michael escorted her back to the elevator, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the crisis facing her family was far from over. Understanding the true nature of Thomas's involvement had answered some questions, but it had also raised far more troubling possibilities about the forces arrayed against the monarchy. The elevator rose through the floors of Kensington Palace, carrying her back to the familiar world of royal protocol and family obligations. But Catherine knew that after today, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The battle for the monarchy's survival was no longer just about family dynamics or press relations. It had become a matter of national security. The emergency meeting of the Privy Council was unprecedented in both its urgency and its secrecy. Called at midnight on a Tuesday, it brought together the most senior figures in British government in the old council chamber at Whitehall, a room that had witnessed constitutional crises for over 400 years. Catherine had never attended a Privy Council meeting before. Queen consorts typically had no role in such proceedings, but these were not typical circumstances. Prime Minister Victoria Ashford sat at the head of the ancient oak table, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of the late hour and the gravity of the situation. Around the table were the Lord President of the Council, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, the Director of MI5, and other officials whose presence indicated the seriousness of the threat they faced. King Edward sat to the Prime Minister's right, his face drawn with exhaustion and stress. He had barely spoken to Catherine since Sir Michael's briefing earlier that day, overwhelmed by the implications of what they had learned about foreign intelligence involvement in the attack on their family. Prince William occupied the chair across from Catherine, his expression unreadable. The revelation that Thomas might have been manipulated rather than willingly complicit had not softened his anger toward Catherine, but it had complicated his understanding of the crisis they faced. Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister Ashford began, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. We are gathered here tonight to address what may be the most serious threat to the stability of the monarchy in modern times. The intelligence we have received suggests that foreign actors have successfully penetrated the royal household and obtained detailed information about state finances and constitutional arrangements. Catherine felt the weight of history in the room. The walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs and prime ministers who had faced their own constitutional crises. But none of them had dealt with the modern complexities of media manipulation and foreign intelligence operations. Sir Michael Hartwell stood and began his formal briefing, his words carrying the precision of someone who understood that every detail might have constitutional implications. Your Majesty, Prime Minister, honorable members of the Council, he began. Our investigation has revealed that Thomas Bowles was targeted for recruitment by an operation that shows hallmarks of foreign intelligence involvement. The sophistication of the psychological profiling, the gradual cultivation process, and the connections to individuals with known foreign intelligence backgrounds all suggest coordination beyond what a commercial media organization could accomplish independently. The director of MI5, Sir James Crawford, leaned forward. Our counterintelligence assessment indicates that this operation was designed not simply to embarrass the royal family, but to destabilize the constitutional monarchy itself. The information extracted from Mr. Bowles provides detailed insights into royal finances, succession planning, and the internal dynamics that could be exploited to create larger constitutional crises. Catherine watched the faces around the table as the implications became clear. This wasn't just about tabloid sensationalism or even domestic political opposition to the monarchy. Foreign powers were actively working to undermine British constitutional stability. What foreign powers are we talking about? Prince William asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Sir Crawford consulted his notes. While we cannot yet prove direct state involvement, The operation bears similarities to destabilization campaigns we've observed from both Russian and Chinese intelligence services. Both nations have strategic interests in weakening British influence in international affairs, and particularly in Commonwealth relationships. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Hamilton, spoke next. The timing is particularly significant. 3 Commonwealth nations, Jamaica, Barbados, and potentially Canada, are currently debating whether to transition from constitutional monarchy to republican government. A major scandal involving the British royal family could tip those decisions against maintaining the crown. Catherine began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. The attack on her family wasn't just personal. It was part of a broader geopolitical strategy to diminish British influence around the world. What about Wellington Media Group? Edward asked. What is their role in this operation? Sir Michael referred to his files. Marcus Wellington appears to have been a willing collaborator, though possibly not fully informed about the foreign intelligence connections. His media empire has significant financial pressures, and there's evidence of substantial payments from shell companies that may have foreign backing. How much does Wellington know? Prime Minister Ashford asked. We believe Wellington knows about the royal family information, but may not be aware of the broader intelligence operation. His focus appears to be on commercial advantage and political influence rather than foreign policy objectives. Catherine felt a surge of anger. Her son had been manipulated by people pursuing not just profit but national security objectives, and he might not even understand the full implications of what he had been drawn into. Where do we stand legally? The Home Secretary asked. The Attorney General, who had been silent until now, spoke carefully. If we can prove foreign intelligence involvement, this becomes a matter of national security rather than press regulation. We would have grounds for arrests under the Official Secrets Act and potentially the National Security Act. However, such actions would inevitably become public and could create the very scandal that the operation was designed to produce. It was a perfect trap, Catherine realized. Investigating the foreign intelligence operation would require public disclosure that might be as damaging as the original attack. The perpetrators had created a situation where the monarchy would be damaged whether they responded aggressively or passively. What about Thomas? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Can we bring him back safely? Sir Crawford looked uncomfortable. Mr. Bowles is currently in Switzerland, but our intelligence suggests he may not be staying there voluntarily. The people who orchestrated his departure may be keeping him isolated to prevent him from providing information that could expose their operation. The possibility that Thomas was being held against his will hit Catherine like a physical blow. Her son, who had already been manipulated and exploited, might now be in actual danger from the people who had used him. Can we extract him? William asked, and Catherine was surprised by the concern in his voice. We're exploring diplomatic options, the Foreign Secretary replied. However, any official intervention would require us to acknowledge that Mr. Bowles is connected to a national security matter, which brings us back to the disclosure problem. Prime Minister Ashford looked around the table. We need to consider our options carefully. We can treat this as a family matter and try to manage it quietly, knowing that the foreign intelligence operation will likely continue. We can launch a full investigation knowing that it will become public and potentially create constitutional instability. Or we can try to find a middle path that neutralizes the immediate threat while protecting long-term stability. What does the middle path look like? Edward asked. We negotiate with Wellington Media Group while secretly investigating the foreign connections, the Prime Minister replied. We meet their demands for reduced royal visibility while building a case that we can use to neutralize the broader operation later. Catherine felt her heart sink. The middle path essentially meant capitulating to the blackmail while hoping to reverse the damage later. It would mean stepping back from her royal duties, reducing her public profile, and allowing the foreign operation to achieve its immediate objectives. With respect, Prime Minister, Catherine said, finding her voice, that approach rewards the people who orchestrated this attack. It tells foreign intelligence services that operations against the royal family can succeed. But it also preserves constitutional stability, William replied. If this becomes a public scandal, it could damage the monarchy permanently. Your stepping back temporarily might be the price we pay for long-term survival. Catherine looked around the table at the faces of the people who would decide her fate, and potentially the future of the monarchy itself. These were the most powerful people in Britain, but they seemed as uncertain and divided as her own family had been. There's another option, Sir Michael said quietly. We could turn this into an opportunity. All eyes turned to him. What do you mean? The Prime Minister asked. If we handle this correctly, We could expose the foreign intelligence operation while actually strengthening public support for the monarchy. We reveal Thomas as a victim of manipulation rather than a willing traitor. We demonstrate that hostile foreign powers see the royal family as such an important symbol of British stability that they're willing to mount sophisticated operations to undermine it. Catherine felt a spark of hope. You're suggesting we tell the truth? I'm suggesting we tell a carefully constructed version of the truth that serves our interests while exposing our enemies. We reveal enough about the foreign operation to discredit Wellington and his collaborators, while protecting sensitive intelligence sources and methods. The idea was appealing but risky. Public revelations about foreign intelligence operations could have unpredictable consequences, potentially damaging relationships with allied nations and revealing capabilities that intelligence services preferred to keep secret. What would be the costs of such an approach? The Foreign Secretary asked. Sir Crawford considered the question. We would need to burn some intelligence assets and reveal some of our counterintelligence capabilities. We might damage relationships with countries that could be implicated. And there's always the risk that additional revelations could emerge that we haven't anticipated. The debate that followed stretched deep into the night. Cabinet ministers, intelligence officials, and constitutional experts argued about precedents, legal authorities, and strategic implications. Catherine found herself caught between her desire to clear Thomas's name and her responsibility to protect the institution of the monarchy. As dawn approached, it became clear that no consensus was emerging. The decision would ultimately rest with the Prime Minister in consultation with the King, but the implications would affect not just the royal family, but the entire British constitutional system. I need 24 hours to consider our options, Prime Minister Ashford finally announced. In the meantime, we maintain absolute secrecy about tonight's discussions. Any leaks could compromise whatever approach we ultimately choose. As the Privy Council members filed out of the chamber, Catherine remained seated, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision facing them. The ancient room, which had witnessed so many constitutional crises over the centuries, seemed to echo with the weight of history. Edward approached her as the room emptied. Whatever we decide, Catherine, we face it together. This crisis isn't of your making, and you shouldn't bear the burden alone. Catherine looked up at her husband, seeing not just the king but the man who had chosen to stand by her through 15 years of public scrutiny and family conflict. What if stepping back is the right thing to do? What if my presence really does make the monarchy more vulnerable? Then, we'll deal with that when we know for certain, Edward replied. But we won't be bullied into making decisions based on the manipulations of foreign intelligence services. As they left the old council chamber together, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the next 24 hours would determine not just her own future, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The battle that had begun with Thomas's recording had evolved into something much larger, a test of whether democratic institutions could defend themselves against sophisticated foreign manipulation without destroying the very values they sought to protect. The morning sun was rising over London as Catherine and Edward made their way back to Kensington Palace. But she felt as though they were still deep in the darkness of an uncertain night. The BBC television centre had never seen anything quite like the controlled chaos that erupted in the hours before the most important royal broadcast in decades. In Studio One, technicians worked frantically to perfect lighting and audio equipment, while security personnel swept every corner for potential threats. Outside, crowds of journalists from around the world had gathered, sensing that history was about to be made. Catherine stood in the makeup chair, watching the final preparations through the studio windows. In less than 2 hours, she would address the nation in a live television broadcast that would either salvage the monarchy's reputation or potentially destroy it forever. The decision to go public with a carefully crafted version of the truth had been made only 18 hours earlier, leaving precious little time to coordinate the complex operation that was now unfolding. Prime Minister Ashford entered the makeup room with Sir Michael Hartwell and several other officials whose presence indicated the gravity of what they were attempting. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of negotiations, legal consultations, and strategic planning as the government had decided to gamble everything on transparency rather than capitulation. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister said, I wanted to brief you personally on the latest developments before you go on air. Catherine nodded, though her stomach was tight with nervousness. The decision to reveal the foreign intelligence operation had triggered a chain of events that was still unfolding in real time. Marcus Wellington has been arrested, Sir Michael reported. When confronted with evidence of the foreign connections to his operation, He chose to cooperate rather than face charges under the National Security Act. He's provided detailed information about how he was approached and funded by the shell companies we identified. This was better news than Catherine had dared to hope for. Wellington's cooperation would provide crucial evidence to support the narrative they were about to present to the public. What about the foreign connections? Catherine asked. We've identified 3 individuals with proven links to Russian intelligence services who were involved in the operation, the Prime Minister replied. They've been declared persona non grata and ordered to leave the country. We're also imposing economic sanctions on the shell companies that funded the operation. Catherine felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. The revelation that her family had been targeted by hostile foreign intelligence services was gratifying in that it proved they weren't simply victims of domestic scandal. But it was also deeply troubling to realize that their personal lives had become battlegrounds in international espionage. And Thomas? Catherine asked, the question that had been foremost in her mind for days. Sir Michael smiled slightly. Mr. Bowles is currently en route back to London. It turns out that Swiss authorities were very cooperative once we provided evidence that he had been coerced into leaving the country. He should arrive at Heathrow approximately 1 hour before your broadcast begins. Catherine felt tears sting her eyes. The thought that Thomas would be safely home, regardless of the mistakes he had made, was an enormous relief. The past week of not knowing whether he was safe had been almost as painful as learning about his involvement with Wellington Media Group. How is he? Catherine asked. Physically fine, but emotionally shaken, Sir Michael replied. He's prepared to make a public statement acknowledging his role in the affair and explaining how he was manipulated. His account corroborates everything we've discovered about the foreign intelligence operation. Prince William entered the makeup room at that moment, looking more subdued than Catherine had seen him since the crisis began. The revelation that Thomas had been targeted and manipulated by foreign intelligence services had clearly affected his understanding of the situation. Catherine, William said, his voice lacking the anger that had characterized their previous conversations. I owe you an apology. I was wrong about Thomas's motivations and about your role in this crisis. Catherine was surprised by the admission. Throughout their 15-year relationship, William had never explicitly apologized for anything, though there had been many occasions when one might have been warranted. We were all operating with incomplete information, Catherine replied diplomatically. The important thing now is that we present a united front. William nodded. I wanted you to know that I'll be watching your broadcast with the rest of the family. Whatever our past disagreements, we stand together when the monarchy itself is under attack. The gesture meant more to Catherine than she had expected. For years, she had felt like an outsider within the royal family, tolerated but never truly accepted. The crisis had apparently changed something fundamental in those relationships. Edward appeared in the doorway, looking more confident than he had since the crisis began. The decision to fight back rather than capitulate seemed to have reinvigorated him, reminding Catherine of the man who had courted her so persistently 2 decades earlier despite the obvious complications of their relationship. 5 minutes, Your Majesty, the floor manager announced. Catherine stood up from the makeup chair and smoothed her navy blue dress. The color had been chosen deliberately, authoritative and dignified, but not so formal as to seem detached from ordinary concerns. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to project the right combination of strength and accessibility. Remember, the Prime Minister said as they walked toward the studio, you're not just defending yourself or your family tonight. You're defending the principle that democratic institutions cannot be undermined by foreign manipulation. The studio felt cavernous despite all the equipment and personnel. Catherine took her seat behind the simple desk that had been positioned to provide an appropriate backdrop of British symbols without appearing overly formal. Behind her, the royal standard hung alongside the Union Jack, visual reminders of the constitutional principles she was defending. 30 seconds, the floor manager announced. Catherine looked directly into the camera, thinking about the millions of people who would be watching around the world. This broadcast would be carried not just by British networks, but by international news organizations that were eager to see whether the British monarchy would survive this latest crisis. The red light on the camera came on, and Catherine began the most important speech of her life. Good evening. I am speaking to you tonight about events that have deeply affected my family and that strike at the heart of our democratic institutions. Over the past week, you may have heard rumors and speculation about recordings and revelations involving my son and members of the royal family. Tonight, I want to tell you the truth about what really happened. My son Thomas was the target of a sophisticated operation designed to extract private information about the royal family and to damage the reputation of the monarchy itself. This operation was not the work of journalists pursuing legitimate public interest stories. It was a carefully planned intelligence operation with connections to foreign powers who seek to destabilize British democratic institutions. Thomas was approached months ago by people who presented themselves as media professionals interested in his perspective on contemporary British society. These individuals gradually gained his trust, exploited his financial vulnerabilities, and manipulated him into revealing private family information. When Thomas realized what he had been drawn into, he was coerced into leaving the country to prevent him from exposing the operation. I want to be absolutely clear. My son made serious errors in judgment. He spoke about private family matters that should have remained confidential. He accepted money from people whose true motivations he did not understand. These were mistakes, and he takes full responsibility for them. But Thomas was a victim as well as a participant. He was targeted not because of anything he had done, but because of his connection to the royal family. The people who manipulated him used sophisticated psychological techniques developed by intelligence professionals. They exploited his insecurities and his financial difficulties to turn him into an unwitting agent of foreign influence. The information that was extracted from Thomas was not simply tabloid gossip. It included details about royal finances, constitutional arrangements, and private discussions that could be used to damage Britain's relationships with Commonwealth nations and to undermine public confidence in democratic institutions. This operation was part of a broader campaign by hostile foreign powers to weaken British influence around the world. These same forces have interfered in elections in other democracies, have spread disinformation through social media, and have sought to exploit divisions within democratic societies. Tonight, working with our intelligence services and our allies, we have exposed this operation and taken action against those responsible. Foreign agents involved in targeting my family have been expelled from the country. British citizens who collaborated with this operation are being held accountable under our national security laws. But this crisis has also taught us important lessons about ourselves and our institutions. The royal family is not above criticism, and we should not be immune from legitimate scrutiny of our role in public life. We serve at the pleasure of the British people, and we must earn that trust through our actions every day. I have spent 15 years as a member of this family trying to honor the traditions of the monarchy while helping it adapt to the needs of a modern democracy. That work has not always been easy, and I have not always succeeded. But I have always tried to put the interests of the British people ahead of my own comfort or convenience. Some have suggested that I should step back from public life to avoid further controversy. I understand that sentiment, but I believe it would send exactly the wrong message. It would tell hostile foreign powers that their operations against British democratic institutions can succeed. It would reward manipulation and punish transparency. Instead, I intend to continue serving as Queen Consort with your support and consent. But I also commit to greater transparency about our role, our finances, and our decision-making processes. The royal family should not be a target for foreign manipulation because our affairs are shrouded in unnecessary secrecy. The monarchy belongs to the British people, not to any individual or family. It is your institution, and it should serve your interests. If we have lost your confidence, then we must work to earn it back through our actions, not through public relations campaigns or media manipulation. My son Thomas will also address you directly in the coming days. He will explain in his own words how he was manipulated and what he learned about the threats facing our democratic institutions. His experience, though painful, has provided valuable insights that our intelligence services will use to protect against future operations. The past week has been the most difficult of my life. It has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my family, about the institution I serve, and about the broader threats facing democratic societies around the world. But it has also reminded me why the work we do matters and why it is worth defending against those who would destroy it for their own purposes. The monarchy is not perfect. No institution created by human beings ever can be. But it is yours, and it will survive and thrive only if it deserves your continued support. I pledge to you tonight that we will work every day to prove worthy of that trust. Thank you for listening, and good evening. The red light on the camera went dark, and Catherine felt a profound sense of relief. The words she had just spoken would be analyzed and debated for days to come, but she had said what needed to be said with honesty and conviction. The studio erupted in controlled applause from the crew and officials who had witnessed the broadcast. Catherine stood up from the desk, feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. For 15 years, she had carefully measured every public word to avoid controversy. Tonight, she had spoken from the heart about the most painful experience of her life. Edward appeared at her side, his eyes bright with pride and relief. That was perfect, Catherine. You found exactly the right balance between strength and humility. Prime Minister Ashford approached with a broad smile. The early polling data is already coming in, Your Majesty. Public approval ratings are actually rising. The British people appreciate honesty, and they don't like foreign interference in their affairs. Catherine felt overwhelmed by the support she was seeing from people who had been skeptical about the monarchy just hours before. The decision to trust the public with the truth, rather than trying to manage the crisis through secrecy and misdirection, seemed to be vindicated. There's one more surprise, Sir Michael said, leading Catherine toward the studio exit. Thomas arrived early. He's waiting to see you. Catherine's heart raced as they walked down the corridor toward a small private room where Thomas was waiting. She hadn't seen her son since the morning when the crisis had begun, and she wasn't sure what to expect from their reunion. Thomas stood up as she entered the room, his face showing the strain of the past week, but also genuine remorse and relief at being home. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. "Mother," Thomas finally said, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm so sorry. I never intended for any of this to happen. I never understood what they were really doing." Catherine crossed the room and embraced her son, feeling the tension and fear of the past week finally beginning to subside. "You were manipulated by professionals, Thomas. The important thing is that you're safe and that we can move forward together." "I watched your broadcast," Thomas said. "You defended me when you had every right to abandon me. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty." "You're my son," Catherine replied simply. "That's what family means, even when we make terrible mistakes." As they stood together in the small room, Catherine realized that the crisis that had threatened to destroy her family had ultimately brought them closer together. The foreign intelligence operation had failed not just because it had been exposed, but because it had strengthened the bonds between people who had been divided by years of misunderstanding and resentment. Outside, the first newspaper headlines were already being printed with news of the royal family's dramatic revelation about foreign interference. The story would dominate international news for weeks to come, but Catherine felt confident that the monarchy had emerged stronger rather than weaker from the crisis. The battle for the royal family's survival was over, but the larger struggle for democratic institutions against foreign manipulation would continue. Catherine had learned that transparency and honesty, even when painful, were more powerful weapons than secrecy and misdirection. As she left BBC Television Centre that night, surrounded by security officers and government officials, Catherine looked up at the London sky and felt hopeful for the first time in days. The crisis had ended not with capitulation or compromise, but with truth and unity. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of ending that the British people deserved.